We are finally at the point where we have only 5 episodes of Core 2 remaining. With episode 22 titled Marching Out the Zombies, it throws us right back into the action after the break from last week. We continue right where we had left off with Ichigo's momentous return and his heartbreaking encounter with Uryu. Now this comes off of the hype of the last 5 episodes, as episode 22 plays the role of lowering the tension and introducing a couple of familiar faces back to the battlefield. This is of course the calm before the storm, since we know that things are about to get dialed back up to 100 in the next 4 episodes. Honestly speaking, I feel the team really understood the assignment this week, because the episode is filled with multiple changes and rearranging of events, which allows for episode 22 to really set the tone for the last 4 action-packed episodes that we're about to receive. Now this isn't to say that the episode had no action whatsoever. Despite adapting quite a bit of action, surprisingly, Marching Out the Zombies still manages to keep the tone much lighter than I had expected. And by lighter tone I mean as light as an episode can be, with Giselle causing havoc. Episode 22 surprisingly retains a good amount of the comedic scenes from the manga, which for the most part are faithfully adapted instead of being cut outright. Some light-hearted tone was exactly what the story had needed at this point, and it's excellent setup for the finale of Core 2. Unlike the last few episodes, which have adapted a large number of chapters, this week's episode adapts material from the beginning of chapter 587 to the end of chapter 591, taking us up to the end of volume 65 of the manga. In my opinion, we had a much more of a balanced pacing here, as we adapt 5 chapters into this week's episode, which hopefully will be the rate at which the anime will stick to for the remainder of Core 2. The episode adapts the confrontation between Giselle and the Shinigami as she faces off against Ikkaku, Yumichika, and then Mayuri. Definitely be sure to stick around until the end of this video, because I will be discussing the first appearance of Mayuri Kurosuchi's corpse unit within the anime, along with a massive revelation as to who Giselle has just added to her undead army. In addition to this, we finally see the return of Best Girl Yoriichi to the story, and so much more, all within this latest installment of the 1000 Year Blood War arc anime. So without further delay, here is my breakdown and analysis of episode 22 Marching Out the Zombies. So let's start by talking about the pacing of episode 22. We immediately continue from where we had left off in episode 21. I originally had thought that the massive shockwave created from Yhwach's ascent had been removed from the anime, since nothing that happened during the scene suggested that a massive shockwave was going to appear afterwards. Now this is something that I think that the episode itself acknowledges, because it opens up by re-showing us the final interaction from the end of episode 21. When Ichigo calls out to Uryu as he ascends with Yhwach, there's a massive shockwave that appears a split second after they tear through the Serite barrier. The shockwave devastates the entire area, and not only do we see its effects on Ichigo, Orihime, and Chad, but we also see how its massive devastation spreads across the battlefield and affects even the surrounding Shinigami and Quincy. There's a really cool anime original scene where Renji jumps in the way of a massive boulder hurtling towards Rukia and protects her from it. Now this is a really nice scene that ties exceptionally well with the manga, and it's also a really nice Renji Rukia moment for those of you who care. After the shockwave disperses, we're brought back to Orihime, Chad, and Ichigo, who discuss what Uryu being on the side of the enemy means to them and their friendship. Now this is where Ichigo comes to terms with the fact that he's going to have to fight Uryu no matter what he does. Ever since the battle against the Quincy, he had thought about what this means for his relationship with Uryu. Regardless of the doubts that he may have towards Uryu's intentions, he thinks back to all of the times that he has helped them during their battles across the series. Ichigo, along with Chad and Orihime, understand what they need to do, as they say that they will listen to Uryu's reasoning for joining Yhwach, and if it isn't good enough then they will force him to come back. Now the atmosphere is very dark and heavy, and it stays that way when Urahara arrives and offers to take them to the Soul King's palace. Ichigo accepts his offer with a resolute yes, which perfectly cues into the opening song. After the opening, the episode continues with an anime original scene that reveals that Byakuya used Zenbon Sakura to protect himself from the flying debris. He then observes the surrounding area as Byakuya wonders what the Quincy are doing as he watches Yhwach and company travel to the royal palace. While Byakuya thinks about the intentions of the Quincy, he's cut off by the stern-written Nanana, who reminds him that they are still alive. The two are then joined by Candice and Robert, as Candice is still salty about Ichigo, and is no surprise since her grudge against him even outlives the main canon of the manga. This of course is a reference to her being schooled by Ichigo in Can't Fear Homeworld. Robert on the other hand says nothing and looks at the new gaping void in the Soul Society sky. In this scene, it's almost like Robert is thinking about something, and I really like this because it serves as a piece of foreshadowing for an upcoming reveal that we'll see hopefully in the next few episodes. The three then surround Byakuya and it appears as though they're about to attack him, but we don't see this fight in this week's episode as we move on to another anime original scene. I am hoping that we will get an anime original fight where Byakuya battles these three Sternritter, because I think that it would make an awesome addition and it would really do well to expand Byakuya's role within the story. The next anime exclusive scene opens up with Iba rising up from underneath some debris, and considering we last had seen him picking up Komamura after he had transformed into his animal state, it's clear that Captain Komamura isn't going to be too far away from him. This is immediately confirmed as Komamura is also seen rising up from the debris nearby. Iba asks his captain if he will lend him a hand, but of course receives no answer from the mindless beast that was once his captain. Komamura then begins to walk towards the Quincy castle as Iba wonders if his captain has agreed with him, thinking about how much he can understand him, and this is before he then starts to follow his captain. We then move back to more familiar territory as we go to a scene most of us are quite familiar with from the manga, as it shows Renji in his Bankai form propping up a massive slab of rock with his Bankai ape form. Now it is implied that Renji had used his Bankai to protect Rukia from the falling debris, and the two then discuss what they've now seen, with Rukia in particular being very disturbed by Uryu's betrayal. This is where Bazbi then cuts in with his offer to team up so that they can kill Uryu together. I was worried that the comedic interaction between Bazbi and Renji was going to be cut out from the anime, but thankfully in this light-hearted episode they actually did adapt the entirety of this interaction. I mentioned before that this episode serves to de-escalate the tension from the last few episodes, and it's great that this installment had retained most of the comedic moments from the manga. This leads me to believe that the reason that most of the gag scenes were removed from previous episodes was purely to maintain tonal consistency in the story. This is because of the differences between the mediums of manga and anime, and within the anime whenever a comedic scene had felt tonally inappropriate, then it wasn't adapted into the episode, which I think is a great thing to do. Now moving on from this, Giselle's fight with Ikkaku and Yumichika is up next, and the scene is adapted extremely well. Some might complain that the scene was adapted a bit too faithfully, but I'm personally glad that nothing was altered to any degree, but you know for sure that some people on Twitter are going to be rabid about it, and it's probably best to leave it at that. What I'd rather talk about is just how amazing Nao Toyama, Giselle's voice actress, really is. Her ability to depict the multifaceted aspects of Giselle's personality is nothing short of impressive. She's able to perfectly embody both Giselle's extremely innocent side and her much darker side, which highlights how she is a borderline psychopath. Toyama's performance alone raises Giselle's likability by a whole lot, and I'm so glad that Kubo and Taguchi chose her for the job. She fills her role as Giselle with so much life and personality that it's pretty enjoyable seeing her on screen. Now after Giselle summons Bambietta, we're taken back to Urahara and the gang back at the lab. This is where Urahara explains to Ichigo and company about the nature of Kukakushiba's cannon system and the replica that him and Mayuri have created. We then get Yoriichi's reintroduction into the story since we haven't seen her in forever. Unfortunately, her introduction in the anime is very different to how it is within the manga, but I'll talk more about the differences in detail during my manga versus anime video I'll upload tomorrow. After Yoriichi's appearance, Urahara begins to explain why he had contacted the Vizards to study the spatial distortions within the world of the living. This explanation is also accompanied by a really cute anime original scene of the Vizards messing around with a spatial distortion. Now surprisingly, I really enjoyed this addition. Urahara also adds that he ordered Yoriichi and Hiyori to gather the energy from the spatial distortions since they generated a lot of energy, enough energy to create a connection between two separate worlds. And knowing that Urahara's side hustle is literally being Batman, he of course predicted that the energy could be of use during a situation like the one that Ichigo and the others are in. They then prepare to take off and we're sent back to Giselle's battle with the vice captains. While Ikkaku and Yumichika are being chased by zombie Bambi, they analyze and quickly deduce the nature of Bambi's shrift. Within the anime, this moment is greatly carried by the storyboard of the episode, which makes even this regular chase scene look quite engaging, due to the multiple perspectives that we see them run from as the explosions detonate behind them. After they figure out how to take down Giselle, the two of them begin to take action. Now this whole sequence is faithfully adapted within the manga while also being really well animated. The part that I really enjoyed the most was when Bambi's chopped off hand falls to the ground and it's blown away by the bomb that it was holding. I loved how well the compositing of the explosion was. Actually, all the explosions in this episode look absolutely fantastic, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this episode may have some of my favorite explosions in all of Core 2. Now speaking of explosions, after their failed attempt at killing the undead Bambi, the duo take a massive explosion at point blank range. Their incapacitated by the explosive, which leaves them open to Gigi's attempt at zombifying them. If you remember how I had talked about Giselle's finger producing more blood than a finger should ever be capable of producing in my zombification video, well, the anime decided to take things up a notch. Giselle's finger bleeds a steady stream for almost 15 seconds straight, which I found really funny for some reason. Mayuri then interrupts the scene as he looks absolutely divine upon his arrival, as his entry literally casts the scene in a different light, and there's some really gorgeous shots that make up this entire scene. The interaction between Giselle and Mayuri is fully maintained, and the two talented voice actors behind these characters bounce off of each other so incredibly well. They're however then interrupted by Bambi's arrival, and her then very questionable moment with Giselle begins. And amazingly, the anime manages to make it seem even more menacing and disturbing than the manga counterpart. Mayuri thankfully saves us from having to watch that any longer, and their fight begins. The bomb chase scene is a very nicely animated sequence, which is once again carried by the storyboard by Yoichi Fujita. It has mostly average animation, but it's held together by such a good storyboard that it still looks very engaging. Both Mayuri and Giselle call their zombie troops to the battlefield, and the two factions begin to clash. Once again, the mostly comedic introduction of the Kurosuchi Corps unit is maintained within the anime, and I didn't realize how much I'd missed seeing these gag scenes until I'd seen them adapted into this week's episode. It also helps that the comedic interactions between all the characters are also adapted with a lot of love, which makes it even funnier to see unfold. The episode ends with Charlotte nuking zombie Bambi with a surprisingly well animated Sero, and Giselle calling the now zombified HITSUGAYA to fight on her behalf. So the episode was significantly less intense in comparison to the past few episodes, and I don't say this to discredit it. This is exactly what we needed, since it serves as a breather from the marathon of intense fights that we've had to go through thus far. It allows the story to reposition itself to move into the next phase of its progression. This is because after the events of episode 21, one can almost say that it had marked the end of the second invasion, and it had started the raid on the Soul King's Palace mini arc. So this episode, and presumably episode 23, will serve as the transitional phase between the two narrative points. This also explains why it's an episode that feels much slower too, which brings me to the pacing of this episode. It's quite relieving to note that the pacing is much slower in this week's episode, which should be expected as the tone is a lot lighter here this week. The slower pacing can be directly attributed to the number of chapters that have been adapted, covering content from chapters 587 all the way up until the end of chapter 591, while also omitting some sections with the intention of adapting them into future episodes. Everything involving Yhwach and Squad Zero is completely removed from this week's episode, and it'll hopefully be included in episode 24 onwards. This choice really helps to set the tone of the episodes as it remains consistent throughout, which not only prevents any jarring shifts in tone, but it also helps viewers to focus on the less tense content so that they don't feel like their time is being wasted or that they're missing out on anything major that's currently happening when the story shifts from those scenes, which is one of the strongest points of this week's installment of Bleach. The rearranged content also helps the pacing since it essentially lessens the content to be adapted, and it creates room for expansion and addition, which we see for ourselves with how many anime original scenes there were in episode 22. This episode played a much more crucial role than many would have imagined, and I think that it did an excellent job adapting the manga material, and it was a very strong episode with all things considered. Now, there isn't that much that can be said about this episode's animation, since it for the most part had average animation, though it had gorgeous effects and equally great art direction. But the star of this episode is undoubtedly the storyboarding. Keeping with the tradition of great storyboarding, Yoichi Fujita brings another well storyboarded episode to the table, one that uses very spacious layouts that play to the strengths of the episode's production, which is its art direction, along with making up for the average animation with creatively constructed scenes. For a low priority episode, this was definitely a big win for episode 22. This now brings us to the end of Marching Out the Zombies. This episode was a great way to set the stage for the last few episodes of Core 2. We didn't see Yhwach, Hashward and Uryu arrive in the Royal Palace and confront the Zero Division, which is a scene from chapter 588. Instead, this has been saved for later, which shows how well planned out this adaptation really is. The sequence of events are being altered so that the story flows much better within the anime. There are several elements that I really enjoyed about episode 22, particularly the anime exclusive scenes, which showed us more of Shunsui, Byakuya and even Komamura. And this is not to mention how the anime has padded out certain scenes between Ichigo, Chad and Orihime, as well as giving the role of Yoriichi and the Vizards a bit more importance in the anime. Then the second half of the episode featured Mayuri, the MVP of this arc, finally joining the battle battlefield, as well as the reveal of the resurrected Urahara, and topping things off very nicely with zombified HITSUGAYA appearing. With only a few episodes left to go, the remainder of Core 2 promises to end things on a very impactful note, and I cannot wait to experience it with all of you. Now definitely make sure that you stick around to the channel by subscribing, because I'm going to be uploading my follow-up manga vs anime comparison video tomorrow. This is where I'm going to be going over every cut, change and addition that has been made to this week's episode. As always, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and I cannot wait to see you in my manga vs anime comparison video tomorrow.
If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.